The Maelstrom Zone, the Golgothan Wastes, the Outer Dark. When the Carcharodons were sent to the fringes of the galaxy, the Imperium called it a punishment, a penance for tactics too brutal even by Astartes standards. That explanation has always had a structural problem. The Imperium does not dispatch its most ruthless executioners to the most dangerous corner of the galaxy simply to make them suffer. It sends them there because something needs guarding. 910 of the 41st millennium. The commanders of the Loyalist forces in the Badab War have learned to expect specific horrors in the Maelstrom Zone, and they have built their battle plans around them. Then, a fleet materializes on the edge of the Golgothan Wastes without warning or transponder signal. Gray-hulled warships, battered by what looks like centuries of deep void transit, bearing no markings any Imperial officer present can immediately identify. The Imperial Armour record of the Badab War describes the reaction on both sides as considerable alarm. That is, the restrained language of official military documentation. What is happening, as those officers watch the fleet resolve on their instruments, is something closer to dread. At the fleet's head sails a vessel that registers as impossible on two separate counts. Its hull classification resolves as a Charybdis-class Grand Cruiser, an ancient Crusade-era design, modified well beyond its base specifications. Its armor reads comparable to a standard battle barge. That much is explicable. A Grand Cruiser can carry that protection. What can't be readily explained is the void shield reading. The flagship carries void shielding that rivals the defenses of an Imperial Navy capital warship, not Space Marine specification, naval specification. That discrepancy appears in the Badab War documentation as a documented fact, and no official source in the decades since has offered an explanation for it. The fleet does not maneuver aggressively. It waits. Their commander descends to negotiate. He arrives in archaic Terminator armor, modified beyond standard recognition. Slab plates of gray ceramite layered over plasteel, reinforced with adamantium rods. Dozens of brass bonding studs gleaming across every surface. The whole assembly thrumming with the power required to keep its servo bundles active. He is large even by Space Marine standards. He dwarfs the Astartes officers who receive him. A skull, yellowing and ancient, hangs from a chain at his waist. His helm is boar-snouted. The black lenses of it reflect nothing. He presents credentials, notices patent affirming his chapter's rights and titles, countersigned by High Lords of Terra and Inquisitors who have been dead for centuries. He submits to psychic probing and gene sampling without hesitation or objection. When asked to identify himself, he does so in a voice that the official record describes as never rising above a soft whisper, one that always carried the promise of death. His name is Tyberos. His title is the Red Wake. His chapter is the Carcharodon Astra, the Space Sharks. The chapter's ancient history, drawn from Chapter 1 of the Black Library novel Carcharodons, Red Tive, speaks of a day of exile, a time when those the chapter calls the wandering ancestors were banished from their homeworld and ordered beyond the galaxy's edge at the direction of a figure known only as the Forgotten One. The sacred duty assigned at that moment has never been formally rescinded. Seek out and destroy the enemies of mankind in the empty spaces beyond Imperial borders. That mandate has guided them for approximately 10,000 years. The Imperium frames their presence in the Outer Dark as a consequence of extreme brutality, a systematic disregard for civilian casualties, a willingness to burn entire worlds to achieve an objective. No official Imperial designation actually calls them a penal chapter. No codex, supplement, or Forge World publication applies that label anywhere. Technically, codex compliant. On paper, legitimate. The void shields on the Nicor argue against a simple reading. The evidence surveyed here points toward a theory developed by the fan analyst, citizen of the Imperium, a reading of canonical facts with no official confirmation that no authorized source has chosen to address directly. The Carcharodons' cryo vaults don't hold only fallen battle brothers waiting for a dreadnought chassis. Both lost Primarchs, the 2nd and the 11th, the Forgotten and the Purged, are, the evidence suggests, in Carcharodon custody, one serving as the chapter's enforcer and secret keeper,
one sustaining the fleet's void shields through the null field generated by his imprisoned biology, the Warden, and the battery. The Carcharodon's chief librarian, Tekahurangi, is called the Pale Nomad. He is the oldest member of the chapter. He is described in the Red Tide novel as descended from the wandering ancestors, those that went into space at the behest of the Forgotten One. The oldest member of a chapter 10,000 years old, connected by lineage directly to the founding generation, still active and operational. The Forgotten One. Not the High Lords of Terra, not an inquisitorial legate acting through recognized imperial channels, not the Departamento Munitorum, not the Adeptus Mechanicus, not any standard institution through which the Imperium routes ordinary operations of state. A figure whose name has been reduced to the void where a name should be. The novel is explicit. The chapter was first sent to patrol the void by this individual. The sacred duty originated with them. The chapter reveres the Forgotten One alongside a second figure, the Void Father, treating both with the deference reserved for founding authority. Reverence given to things that can't be spoken of openly. The Shade Lord title creates the most direct structural connection. It's the Carcharodon honorific for the chapter master position. Before the Carcharodons used it, it was held by one figure in the broader imperial record, Arcus Fall, a Raven Guard commander exiled during the Great Crusade. Arcus Fall is the only prior documented holder of that designation. If the Forgotten One is the founding Shade Lord, the figure who received the Emperor's mandate and led the wandering ancestors into the outer dark, then Arcus Fall is the logical terminus of the documented title lineage. The title connects one name to the other, and the record contains no other candidates between them. The chapter's relationship with their supposed parent legion compounds this. The Outer Dark novel describes the Carcharodon connection to the Raven Guard as one of distrust and hostility, and then adds a fragment left without explanation. It speaks of an ancient pact. That pact's content is never elaborated in any available source. The nature of an arrangement between a chapter and its parent legion that produces sustained mutual antipathy, maintained across 10,000 years, is left deliberately obscure. Pacts that endure under those conditions aren't pacts of alliance or brotherhood. They are agreements made under circumstances that left neither party with a comfortable alternative, enforced in silence because the alternative to silence is worse. Something was given to the Carcharodons to carry, something the Raven Guard couldn't refuse to hand over and can't forget having handed over. The shape of everything else in this record suggests it isn't the most significant cargo the Nicor contains. In the Cath Mandau precinct of the Imperial Palace on Terra, the Primarch Rogel Dorn walks past a series of pillars bearing life-sized statues of his brothers. In The Lightning Tower, he observes, "The 2nd and 11th plinths had been vacant for a long time. No one ever spoke of those two absent brothers. Their separate tragedies had seemed like aberrations. Absent. Not destroyed. Not toppled. The plinths remain. The spaces are maintained. In the chamber described in The Unremembered Empire, Robute Guilliman sees 21 chairs built to Primarch scale, one for the Emperor, one for each brother. 2 bear blank penance, plain bleached undyed cloth where heraldry should be. Guilliman tells Lion L. Johnson, "Yet their absence must be marked. Places must be left for them. That is simply honor. Places left for men who can't come."
In Vulcan Lives, the Salamander's Primarch reflects on the prospect of losing another brother to Imperial sanction. It's shame enough to bear the grief for 2. In Fear to Tread, Sanguinius reveals his legion's genetic flaw to Horus and explains why he never brought it to the Emperor's attention. "I won't be responsible for the erasure of the Blood Angels from Imperial history. I won't have a third empty plinth beneath the roof of the hegemon as my legion's only memorial." He knows what fills an empty plinth. He understands the mechanism. He is afraid of it. In Deliverance Lost, Corax meets the Emperor for the first time. The Emperor tells him there are 17 brothers. Corax, who bears the number 19, asks how that can be possible. The Emperor's expression grew bleak, filled with deep sorrow. He replies, "The other 2. That is a conversation for another day." That conversation does not appear anywhere in the record. The Emperor is informing his son that 2 are already gone, as established fact, with no offer of explanation. In the audiobook The Sigillite, Malcador descends into the deepest dungeons beneath the Imperial Palace with his agent Caleb. They pass halls of collected relics and arrive at a massive door covered in Legion symbols. 2 of those symbols have been scratched out or worn away. Malcador doesn't stop. He walks on without comment. In A Thousand Suns, during the triumph of Ulanor, Magnus the Red begins to reference a previous gathering of Primarchs. Mortarion cuts him off. "I know well when it was, Magnus, and the Emperor forbade us to speak of it again. Do you disobey that command?" The command of silence is enforced at the highest level of Imperial authority, and the gathering Magnus almost names is one that included the 2 who would later be erased. In The First Heretic, Lorgar confronts the prospect of imperial censure and draws the parallel directly. "I fear the Emperor will break the word-bearers, and break me. We would be cast alongside the brothers we no longer speak of." Later in the same novel, both erased legions receive epithets applied separately. One, the Forgotten, the other, the Purged. 2 distinct terms, indicating 2 distinct categories of what was done. 2 different processes arriving at the same official result. And the erasure itself is described by Imperial historians as the most successful edict of obliteration ever carried out in Imperial history, more thorough than anything applied to the 9 legions who fought with Horus, who burned the Imperium, who besieged Terra itself. Those legions are listed as excommunicate Tritoris, condemned with their names intact. The 2nd and 11th have entries that read only expunged. The remaining Primarchs swore an oath not to speak of the lost legions, enforced by the Emperor himself. In Prospero Burns, Leman Russ is asked whether Astartes fighting Astartes is unprecedented. He laughs, and the narration notes it's a sad sound. Yolda, no, that's not unprecedented. He isn't speaking of any conflict among the known legions. He is speaking of something that has been removed from the account of events so completely that even the Space Wolves' role in it can't be named. This isn't the silence of men shamed by another's treachery. Primarchs who were embarrassed by a brother's failure could speak of it privately, among themselves, in terms that never reached public record. The silence around the 2nd and 11th is structurally different. It's operative silence, maintained by Imperial command, structured to prevent even private reference. That is the silence men keep when what they can't name is still present somewhere, and naming it carries an operational risk that extends beyond honor or shame.
Several explanations for the fate of the lost Primarchs present themselves. Each carries something to recommend it. None resolves the full weight of what the canonical record shows. The absorption theory, that the loyal elements of both legions were quietly inducted into the Ultramarines and Imperial Fists, their warriors diluted beyond detection, runs into a mechanical problem the Adeptus Mechanicus can't suppress. Gene seed purity testing can identify Primarch lineage. Mandatory monitoring across centuries would surface any unaccounted-for genetic variation in those chapters' lines. The conspiracy required to conceal mass gene seed absorption would need to extend across every Mechanicus genitor who processed a sample from any absorbed legionary across 10 millennia. A compounding coordination problem where each additional generation increases the probability of forensic exposure.
The word-bearers who first proposed the theory within the First Heretic are characters with obvious reasons to undermine the Ultramarines. Ingathel calls it insipid conjecture in the same passage. The Chaos Purge theory, that one or both legions fell to the ruinous powers before the heresy and were destroyed for it, collides with the Imperium's own record-keeping conventions. Traitor legions are condemned with names intact. They are listed as excommunicate traitoris, not expunged. An obliteration more thorough than what was applied to 9 legions who burned the Imperium from within would require a reason more severe than treachery alone. The obliteration of the 2nd and 11th is more thorough. The Emperor's own calculus judged what happened to them worse than rebellion, worse than everything Horus and his 8 brothers did. The shame hypothesis accounts for the obliteration. Sanguinius's fear implies a biological failure severe enough to warrant the same mechanism. Vulcan's grief implies direct witness. The oath implies active suppression rather than passive forgetting. Shame explains the erasure. It does not explain where the erased went. An edict of obliteration removes names from records. It does not resolve the physical question of what happened to a being of Primarch biology, biology that sustained Robute Guilliman through a blade wound to the throat for 10,000 years, that gave Ferrus Manus hands of living metal with full sensation, that allowed Vulcan to regenerate from destruction that would permanently terminate any other form of life. That biology does not die easily. An execution would require a mechanism and a location, both of which constitute physical evidence that can't be unmade from reality regardless of what records say. In the Primarch's anthology, in the story Feet of Iron, Ferrus Manus encounters 20 statues of the Primarchs in the dark. He recognizes all but 2. The masks covering those 2 are split. Almost destroyed, not removed, present, but deliberately damaged, as though someone couldn't decide whether to erase them entirely and settled for defacement. That isn't the treatment of beings confirmed permanently dead. That is the treatment of a memory someone can't resolve. An edict of obliteration is precisely the instrument used to ensure a question stays unanswerable. And lost, the word Imperial sources reach for when they approach this subject at all, implies that the physical answer exists. It's simply not findable by those who are asking. Tyberos holds 2 offices simultaneously, Chapter Master and First Company Master. Direct command of the chapter's elite formation, the Red Brethren, the Terminators of the First Company, combined with the highest executive authority in the chapter fleet. In most chapters, these roles belong to different individuals. The chapter master sets direction and strategy. The First Company Master leads the finest warriors. Combining them in a single individual,
creates an unusual concentration of operational and executive power in one set of hands. The Red Brethren's secondary function is documented in the Badab War records. Tyberos distributes the veterans of his first company among the other companies of the chapter. They serve as fearsome force multipliers and as his eyes, ears, and enforcers, ensuring that all Carcharodon fleets didn't stray from their chapter loyalties. In a standard Space Marine chapter, veterans attached to other companies function as combat assets. The Carcharodon's veterans carry an explicit secondary function: internal surveillance, enforcement of loyalty at the fleet level. In a chapter without a dangerous secret at its center, this architecture is redundant. Astartes are loyal by gene seed, conditioning, and 10,000 years of culture. The infrastructure of surveillance implies something specific to surveil against.
Something that, given enough time and exposure, certain individuals might develop the clarity to articulate. His face, when revealed, is a corpse-white nightmare with half the bones of his face exposed in a bloodless grimace. His eyes are a soulless, depthless black, the liquid black eyes characteristic of the Raven Guard lineage, carried here at their most extreme expression. He is never seen outside the archaic Terminator armor. In formal contexts, he never raises his voice above a soft whisper that always carries the promise of death, hunger, and slake. Two gauntlets, barbed power blades combined with inner maws of underbite mechanized chain blades fitted with adamantium teeth. Their manufacture is unknown to the tech priests of Mars. No recognized pattern. The chapter provides the unofficial history in Carcharodons. Outer Dark. The weapons once belonged to the master of the Raven Guard's 18th chapter, the Terran formation that Primarch Corvus Corax himself exiled to the Ghoul Stars before the Horus Heresy, which survived into the modern era as the renegade Black Shields called the Ashen Claws. Tyberos provoked their current master, Nihat Nev, into a direct duel and claimed hunger and slake as the prize. Nihat Nev still seethes at their loss. He continues to provoke the Carcharodons' ire whenever the chapter is forced to deal with him. Tools taken from the only other inheritors of the same original exile lineage. A conflict fought between two parties connected by a history neither will fully articulate. When the Ashen Claws encounter the Carcharodons, they identify them as something foreign to the shared Raven Guard origin, calling them mongrel and traitor-born.
When that same Ashen Claw leader encounters a World Eater in captivity during the events of Outer Dark, he calls the World Eater the Carcharodons' brother. A gene seed identification. An accusation the Carcharodons don't refute in the novel's account of the encounter. In Carcharodons' Outer Dark, Carcharodons, the oldest member of the chapter, the Psyker whose lineage traces directly to the wandering ancestors, watches Tyberos encounter a Tyrannid boarding assault mid-conversation. Tyberos simply moves to meet it. Carcharodons does not raise his staff. He has nothing to add to what happens next. A warrior whose chapter's most powerful Psyker considers himself operationally redundant in that warrior's proximity isn't simply capable. He is a weapon aimed at something specific. The Void Exile Protocol reveals the other edge of Tyberos's institutional architecture. Members of the chapter who succumb to a genetic madness called the blindness, those overcome by a dissolution of reason and self, aren't treated, entombed, or executed. They are stripped of all titles and ranks and sent alone into deep space to undertake suicide missions until they inevitably perish. Removed from the fleet, removed from the chapter, removed from any future context in which their particular dissolution could become a problem for the chapter's operational security. What emerges from the blindness isn't simply violence or incapacity.
Those can be managed in an Astartes chapter by other means. What the Void Exile Protocol removes is men who have reached a certain internal threshold of knowledge, and might find, at the edge of coherence, that they can articulate what they know.
The specific thing requiring a chapter-wide surveillance network, an enforcement culture built on dread rather than brotherhood, and a structured protocol for discarding psychologically compromised members before their dissolution becomes communicable. That thing isn't any external enemy the Outer Dark has produced. It's a secret maintained for 10,000 years. Tyberos is the current keeper of it. Every Shade Lord before him carried the same weight. Every one of them, tracing back through the office to Arcos Fall, the founding holder, the most plausible candidate for the Forgotten One, the figure who received the mandate and led the wandering ancestors into the dark. Tyberos isn't the prisoner in the Nicor's deepest hold. Every element of his institutional design points toward the opposite. The Carcharodons carry no formal penal chapter designation. They are technically codex compliant with minor deviations. On paper, a legitimate chapter with obscure heritage. Their technology declines to cooperate with that framing. Mark V. Heresy pattern power armor dates to the Horus Heresy era. The Badab War documentation describes it as constituting the majority of the Carcharodons' standard equipment, not a relic worn by veterans, not a preserved example maintained in an armory, but default operational issue across the chapter. A chapter with Heresy-era armor as its standard configuration is a chapter that was either present during the Heresy or has maintained unbroken access to pre-Heresy manufacture across 10,000 years. Pre-Heresy production runs aren't being restocked through normal supply chains. A chapter drawing continuously on those stockpiles was provisioned once, for an operation expected to run indefinitely, by someone with the authority and resources to ensure perpetual supply. No standard founding process includes that provision. The gene seed is the most structurally significant anomaly. Listed in official records as of unknown origins and possibly chimeric, chimeric meaning more than one source, the Ashen Claws, themselves descended from exiled Raven Guard, encounter the Carcharodons and don't recognize them as close relatives. They call them mongrel and traitor-born. When the same Ashen Claw leader identifies a captive world eater as the Carcharodons' brother, pointing to a genetic kinship, the Carcharodons neither confirm nor credibly deny it in the record of that encounter. A second gene seed source, unidentified. No chapter in good Imperial standing carries gene seed from a lineage the Imperium expunged. The options narrow quickly. The chimeric second source derives either from a Primarch the Imperium acknowledges or from a Primarch line the Imperium erased. The acknowledged lineages are all accounted for by their successor chapters. The erased lineages are two, the second and the 11th. Each anomaly in isolation admits an innocent explanation. The Void Shields reflect the Grand Cruiser hull class. The ancient armor reflects long Void service. The gene seed is unexplained heritage. Assembled across a single organization operating in classified secrecy for 10 millennia, they require too many separate coincidences to be coincidences. The alternative requires one additional premise. The equipment, credentials, and assignments were provided through an arrangement at the Imperium's highest levels, in exchange for a service that could never be publicly stated. A blank, in the Imperium's understanding, carries the pariah gene. The condition produces no presence in the immaterium. The warp can't perceive them. Psychers near a blank experience extreme disruption of their abilities, physical discomfort, a deep, instinctive aversion that operates below conscious processing. Even ordinary humans find prolonged proximity deeply uncomfortable when they can't identify the cause. Warp entities within the radius of the null field are weakened or actively driven back. The effect is passive and biological, requiring no activation or maintenance. It exists as long as the biology persists. The Calexis assassin represents the most intense, naturally occurring expression of this trait that the Imperium can identify and deploy. The Calexis carries a device called the Animus Speculum. The canonical description of what it does is the mechanical foundation on which the most important element of this reconstruction depends. The energy drained from their surroundings by their blank aura is channeled into directed blasts. The null energy is harvestable. The passive biological emanation of a blank can be collected, focused, and deployed through a technological interface. The Officio Assassinorum already performs this operation at human scale. The Animus Speculum demonstrates that null field output can be captured and redirected. The mechanism isn't theoretical.
It's an operational use. Void shields, in standard 40K mechanics, operate through warp interaction. Incoming energy and mass are shunted briefly into the Imperium, where they dissipate. The mechanism requires a stable warp interface, a point where the Imperium is predictably accessible, and the energy exchange can occur without catastrophic feedback. In the Golgothan Wastes and the deep outer dark beyond settled Imperial space, warp storms aren't weather events. They are the permanent condition of the region. The Imperium presses against real space there in ways that destabilize navigation and degrade warp-dependent systems continuously. A void shield attempting to shunt incoming fire into an Imperium that is already turbulent and compressed is working against active resistance on every cycle. The standard mechanism degrades in exactly the operational environment the Carcharodons permanently inhabit. Other forces operate in the Maelstrom Zone. Chaos warbands move through it. The Carcharodons hunt them there. Hostile traffic is present, but no other Loyalist chapter maintains a comparable permanent operational presence across the full depth of the outer dark, across the entire breadth of Imperial history. The Carcharodons don't visit the region and return. Their fleet-based existence in this environment, sustained over 10 millennia, requires something beyond the standard void shield mechanism that degrades in precisely those conditions. A null Primarch would be a different order of phenomenon from any human blank. Primarch biology is documented to produce outcomes that defy the processes that created it. Guilliman survived a blade wound to the throat for 10,000 years in stasis. Ferrus Manus carried hands of living metal with full sensation. Vulcan regenerated from destruction that would permanently terminate any other form of life. Primarch creation produced 20 distinct biological impossibilities from a single framework. The null direction is no more impossible than any of them. And if one of the 20 Genetor tanks scattered by the chaos vortex landed in conditions that shape the null physiology toward expression rather than dormancy, the result would be something the Imperium had never seen and couldn't afford to deploy anywhere near the warp-dependent infrastructure that keeps the galaxy-spanning empire functional. At Primarch biology, the null field wouldn't simply be a stronger blank. It would function as a local zone of warp exclusion. The Imperium wouldn't just be weakened near the source. It would be actively pushed back. A fleet sailing within that zone wouldn't need void shields that shunted energy into the Imperium. The Imperium would already be held at a distance the storms can't bridge. A Primarch-level null would be catastrophic in normal Imperial space.
Navigators, whose warp-touched physiology makes interstellar travel possible, would find their abilities destroyed in proximity. Astropaths would be silenced. Any warp-dependent infrastructure in the region would cease to function.
The outer dark, beyond any established navigational network, past every shipping lane, removed from all infrastructure that depends on clean warp access, is precisely the location where such a being could exist without destroying the systems the Imperium depends on to function. Not merely where the Carcharodons were sent, the only place their cargo could safely be kept. In The First Heretic, one of the Gal Vorbak states that killing the 11th Primarch in his infancy would unwrite a shameful future. That isn't the language of a man describing a monster. It's the language of a man who can see a trajectory that ends somewhere terrible, somewhere that required the most thorough erasure in Imperial history to prevent from becoming known. A shameful future, not a destroyed one. A future that had to be redirected rather than prevented from occurring. Robute Guilliman was placed in a stasis field after receiving a wound from the Primarch Fulgrim. He remained in that field for approximately 10,000 years before his revival at the end of the 41st millennium. The experience, as conveyed across the novel record surrounding his return, is consistent with time suspension mechanics, a field that freezes the passage of time in a confined area for the subject within it. Consciousness is suspended. Duration does not pass for the subject. They stop, and then, if the field is lifted, resume. That isn't the only form of preservation the Imperium employs. The alternative isn't time suspension, but biological deceleration through extreme cold. Life processes slow to a minimum viable threshold.
The subject isn't frozen in time. Their biology continues, at the lowest sustainable rate, maintained in a state that prevents deterioration without halting the fundamental continuity of the organism. The distinction matters for what follows. A null field is a passive biological emanation. It does not require the subject's active consciousness or will. It requires only that the biology persists. In cryopreservation, the biology persists. The null field persists with it, at reduced intensity compared to full wakefulness, but continuous. Not suspended with the consciousness in the manner of a true stasis field. Not frozen entirely. Reduced, but ongoing. Present. The modified void shield systems on the Nicor, running at naval specification, exceeding Space Marine standards by a margin no official source has explained through engineering or logistics, would provide the collection and direction mechanism. The same principle the animus speculum demonstrates at human scale, applied through larger systems to a source of incomparably greater output. The null field, collected, focused, projected outward as a permanent zone of warp exclusion surrounding the fleet. The storms of the outer dark pressing against it and falling back. Cryopreservation at minimum biological threshold does not carry the guarantee of the blank nothingness of time-frozen stasis. What remains at minimum viable expression isn't thought as continuous narrative, not memory as coherent sequence. But it isn't nothing. Biology maintained at its lowest viable expression, with whatever that threshold state produces, bleeding outward through systems designed to capture and redirect it. The Nicor's shield projectors run at a constant output rate exceeding any stated operational specification for that hull class. The fleet sustains itself in an environment where the standard mechanism fails. That isn't a mechanical anomaly. That is the system functioning exactly as designed, powered by exactly what it was built to carry. The Carcharodons' cultural practices have been documented by every Imperial observer who survived close contact with them. Their armor bears hand-painted symbols of watery predators and skulls. Their gene seed produces extreme aggression and bloodlust, described explicitly in Imperial records as traits not usually associated with the Raven Guard, the lineage they officially claim. Those traits don't come from their stated heritage. They come from the chimeric second source,
the one with no name in any Imperial record the public can access. Members who succumb to the blindness, the genetic madness that emerges from within, triggered by accumulated cognitive experience, aren't treated or entombed. They become void exiles, stripped of all titles and ranks, sent alone into deep space until they perish. Removed from the fleet before that threshold enables an articulation that can't be permitted.
The blindness is genetic, but its distribution within the chapter isn't uniform. It emerges from somewhere specific in the chapter's psychological structure, and the chapter manages it with a protocol so consistent and routinized that it is codified in chapter law. Astartes' conditioning is designed for sustained contact with horror and violence. What produces a blindness this specific, in a chapter this disciplined, isn't the weight of any enemy the Outer Dark has produced. Their demeanor, across every observer account, isn't fierce. Fierceness implies investment, a conviction that makes the violence meaningful. The Carcharodons fight with a ferocity that has unsettled veteran Imperial commanders who spend careers watching Astartes engage at extremes. And then they stop. The ferocity drains away into something empty. They strip the battlefield of anything useful.
They conduct their red tithes, descending on Imperial worlds to take recruits, supplies, and human beings by force, crushing any resistance, leaving populations that fear them as much as any enemy. They disappear back into the dark. The red tithe is operationally significant beyond its stated purpose of recruitment. A chapter that treats every Imperial world it visits as a resource to be extracted, never as a relationship to be cultivated, is a chapter that does not want witnesses who remember them with goodwill, who would want to know more about where they go when they leave and what they carry when they go. Their chapter motto, recorded in official documentation as "From the void we come, darkness there, and nothing more," isn't martial pride. It's a statement of origin and destination that contains zero future. They come, they take, they return to nothing. The trophies, the predator symbols, the grim, joyless demeanor. The Red Brethren embedded fleet-wide, watching, enforcing. These aren't the natural cultural outputs of warriors who are simply brutal. Brutal cultures are energetic. They celebrate. They take pride in their destruction. The Carcharodons don't celebrate anything that survives a battle. They aren't savage. They are compressed. 10,000 years of terrible knowledge finding expression in rituals that maintain physical and psychological distance between the men who carry it and anything that could make it surface. A chapter that knew nothing would behave differently. A chapter that knew everything and had known it for 10,000 years and carried it across the full stretch of human history in the Outer Dark would look exactly like this. The canonical facts form a chain without breaks. The Forgotten One dispatched the Carcharodons into the Outer Dark at the Emperor's direct instruction. The Forgotten One's title is Shade Lord, the same title borne by Arcus Fall, the only other documented holder of that designation in Imperial history. Every subsequent chapter master of the Carcharodons has held that title. Every one of them has maintained the same operational mandate in the same operational zone across 10 millennia. The Nicor carries void shields at naval specification. No official source provides an engineering or logistical explanation for why a Space Marine chapter's flagship carries defenses at that grade. The standard mechanism by which void shields function degrades in the warp storm conditions of the Outer Dark. Something accounts for the Nicor's protection in that environment, and the Animus Speculum demonstrates that null field energy is harvestable technology, already in Imperium-sanctioned use. The chapter's gene seed has a second, unidentified source. The Ashen Claws,
who share the exile lineage and would recognize Raven Guard genetics, identify the Carcharodons as carrying something foreign to that lineage, something that connects, in their reckoning, to a gene line the Imperium no longer acknowledges. The chimeric second source points toward a Primarch whose lineage was erased. The ancient pact with the Raven Guard covers an arrangement maintained in sustained mutual hostility across 10,000 years. Pacts that endure under those conditions protect something both parties understand they can't escape from. An arrangement made under circumstances neither chose and neither can reverse. The 2nd and 11th Primarchs aren't confirmed dead in any canonical source. Their records are expunged. Their plinths are vacant but maintained. Their chairs are kept with blank penance. Places are preserved for them. The Emperor tells Corax the conversation about the other two will come another day. That day isn't recorded anywhere.
No single element of this chain proves the conclusion on its own.
Assembled, they resist every alternative explanation that doesn't require a greater number of separate coincidences than any of the anomalies individually demand. The alternative to the Warden and battery hypothesis requires only one additional premise: that the Imperium made a decision of sufficient horror and sufficient necessity that no official history has been permitted to acknowledge it. What the chain points toward is this: both lost Primarchs are, in all probability, in Carcharodon custody. One, whose null physiology made them fundamentally incompatible with a warp-dependent Imperium, is held in cryopreservation in the Nicor's deepest hold, his null field harvested through the modified void shield systems to sustain the fleet against the warp storms of the outer dark.
The other, possibly the Forgotten One himself,
the figure who accepted the mandate and whose office descends through every Shade Lord to Tyberos. Not a prisoner, but the custodian of the secret. The one who enforces the silence from within. The Warden and the battery. Both removed from Imperial history under the most successful edict of obliteration in recorded history. Both maintained in the outer dark at the Emperor's direction, guarded by the most brutal and effective chapter that level of authority could deploy, sustained by a null field bleeding into the void for 10,000 years. Somewhere past the Golgothan Wastes, past any star map in public Imperial archives, past any point a navigator would willingly chart without classified authorization, the Carcharodon fleet moves through screaming warp storms. The Nicor leads. Its void shields hold the Immaterium at a distance the storms can't bridge.
Gray Hole, ancient designation, naval-grade protection that no official engineering record has explained.
The bridge, behind its command stations, features a vast fish tank as the rear wall, a detail recorded in Carcharodons, outer dark, and left without elaboration, as though the chapter does not require a reason to keep the ocean behind where it commands from. Tyberos walks corridors, no scheduled documents. The Red Brethren hold their positions in every company vessel, watching, reporting, ensuring chapter loyalty holds. The chapter fights its wars, against Tyrannid advance elements in the deep dark, against chaos warbands in the Maelstrom, against whatever the darkness produces, and returns each time to a position no external command authority can chart.
Deep in the Nicor's hull, past the sections that appear in any accessible manifest, past the armories and meditation cells and the standard cryocrypts where fallen battle brothers wait for dreadnought chassis, there is a space no surviving record describes. Something is held there. It has been held there since before the Badab War, since before the War of the False Primarch, since the day of exile when the wandering ancestors followed the Forgotten One into the darkness, and a cargo the Emperor couldn't name in any document that would survive his own palace's security.
Cryopreservation at minimum biological threshold. Life sustained at the edge of its own continuity. A null field that hasn't ceased in 10,000 years. Reduced by the cryostate, captured by the modified projectors, directed outward. The warp storms pressing against the perimeter of the fleet, finding no purchase, breaking, falling back, returning, breaking again. The empty plinths remain in the Imperial Palace.
Guilliman left chairs vacant in that chamber on Ultramar.
The surviving Primarchs kept the oath. The Emperor told Corax the conversation would come another day. It never did. One of the two lost Primarchs was given a purpose. The other was made into one. The decision was made at the highest level of the Imperium, sealed under the most successful edict of obliteration in history, guarded by the most brutal and effective chapter that level of authority could deploy, sustained by a null field bleeding into the outer dark for 10,000 years. The Imperium calls it protection. The Carcharodons call it duty. The thing in the cryo vault carries no name anymore. Names were the first thing the edict took. There is only the hum. The constant hum of a void shield system doing exactly what it was built to do, powered by exactly what it was built to carry, in exactly the location the Emperor chose for it. Always the hum. Subscribe. There are more stories like this one.